everything looks better in slow motion. Well, not everything. There's certain things you really don't want to film in slow motion, especially if they don't actually move that much. Like a tortoise walking along a field. That is already slow motion. I did actually say this phrase, everything looks better in slow motion, at a workshop a few years ago. And somebody put their hand up, and I thought they were joking, but they were deadly serious. And they said, so why do you film stuff at normal speed at all then? Why do you film like your interviews at normal speed? Why are you not doing slow motion for that? I just kind of was a bit dumbfounded. I scratched my head. There are times when slow motion is completely wrong.
And anything with dialogue is that.
There's lots of ways we use slow motion to lift our production value, to make things look great, but we can overuse it. I'm going to spend this episode going through the different ways you can shoot slow motion, the different frame rates from our lower slow motion frame rates of 50p through to our higher frame rates. We're also going to cover how to light for slow motion, which is really important so we get the best possible results. We have a lot to cover, so it's time to crack on. For this first example, I'm going to show you some simple B-roll shots of people going about the business. I'm going to try some different cameras. These are the tools I'm going to be using today. This camera here is a mirrorless camera, and it shoots 4K up to 60 frames per second, and it also does in HD up to 180 frames per second. I'm also going to use this one here, which only shoots 60 frames per second in HD. In 4K it's only up to 30, but it does shoot up to 120 frames per second in a cropped sensor. I'll explain more about that in a bit. This little one here shoots up to 1000 frames per second in an utterly unusable mode, but about 250 it's actually really good, but it only shoots for 4 seconds. This is buffered mode. We'll explain buffered again in a bit. I also have my mobile phone, and this also shoots about 240 frames per second. Not great quality, but for things like Instagram and social media, it's pretty good. I'm also going to steal back my camera, which Julian and Sarah are using to film me, because it shoots 4K in 60 frames per second, in 2K at up to 240 frames per second, and it also does 4K at 120 frames per second max, but only in a 4-second burst. That's a lot of numbers. Let's actually shoot something now. When do you use slow motion? When do you shoot it? Well, when I was shooting the Wunderlist for CNN, for the B-roll, I shot a lot of 4K 60. This is for the really beautiful exotic shots and the scenery of animals and things like that. Because you can always speed it up a little bit. There are some caveats though, depending on the camera that shoots in the 4K 60 frames. Because a lot of the cameras, when they do shoot that, they don't record sound. Where some cameras do record sound when you shoot in that frame rates. It's really important to make sure you get some natural sound, like the motorbikes or other things that actually paint a picture of where you are. We have people walking around. It's nice to get some natural sound. You don't want just some music. So do some slow motion and then record some real time to get some natural sound, or use a sound recorder to capture that other stuff. It's really important. How slow your camera can go is of course dependent on the camera. Some of them are incredibly good and some of them have no slow motion whatsoever. But it's also to do with the system frequency, as in NTSC and PAL, 60i, 50i. NTSC users tend to have a higher frame rate, better slow motion. That's why we call it higher frame rate, which is anything over 60 frames per second. So the camera we're filming me right now shoots in 4K up to 60p. But in PAL, it will only do up to 50p. In HD, it will give me 200 frames per second in PAL and 240 in NTSC. So that is a bit of a downside. It's not always the case. This little one here actually is the other way round. And in PAL, it actually shoots in a higher frame rate. But actually, sometimes you don't need to go as high as the camera can shoot. This is a maximum. It doesn't always mean you should use it. What I'm getting right now is a quick cutaway of this group over there, because they were nattering really loudly during that last little bit's camera. So just making sure we see the sound. We talked about this in the interview episode, and this comes across in every aspect of our filming. So I'm talking, I can hear them, we can't see them, and now we have a shot which establishes them. So you often see slow motion referred to as P or FPS. Which one is which? Well, FPS traditionally refers to what we call an overcrank. So you'll see it written in the camera as, like on this one right now, as 180 FPS at 25p. So our base recording is at 25p, but it's recording 180 frames. So when it plays back, it will automatically be slow motion. As a rule though, tends to be no sound is recorded, it is mute. Now, if you're recording something which is called P, then it does tend to record sound at the same time, because that is not overcrank, it's simply recording at a higher frame rate. On this camera though, when you're shooting in 4K, it doesn't say FPS, it says P, as in 50p or 60p. What this means is it's recording all of those frames at that time base, at 50p or 60p. So you have to change that in post to turn it into slow motion. The advantage of this is it does record sound. The downside is you tend to weaken your bit rate, because when it's recorded at FPS at a base time rate of say 25, it still maintains its full bit rate for that codec. But when you record it at 50p or 60p and you have to change it to slow motion in post, you are stretching out that codec and weakens it. That's really the main downside of doing it that way, because it is really nice to record sound at the same time without having to get additional shots just for the audio. The rule that we established with shutter speed in the first episode needs to be stuck to. That is double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 50p, 1/100th of a second. 180 frames per second here, shoot at 1/360th of a second. If your camera doesn't have a shutter speed that matches exactly double your frame rate, just get it as close as you can, but always make it above rather than below. If you're lucky enough to have a camera that shoots in shutter angle as well as shutter speed, it is actually a lot less faff. This camera over here doesn't have it. So for changing our frame rates from normal speed to slow motion, we're always having to make sure we change our shutter speed, and it's easy to forget to do that, and you end up with some nasty motion blur. If you set your shutter angle, like I can here, to 180 degrees, my shutter speed will always be effectively double my frame rate. Much nicer and much easier, and something else you can just forget about and concentrate on getting the shots. If you're out and about filming, not sure if you want to shoot a bit of slow motion or not, I would always suggest filming in slow motion, because if you don't film in slow motion, you get to the edit and you go, I wish that was slow motion. If you start doing it in post, it's never going to look as good. There are some pretty good plugins out there which do a fairly good job, but it's never going to look as good as doing it in camera. The only real downside to shooting in slow motion, if you don't need it, you're going to play it at real time and you get into the edit, is your shutter speed is going to be too high. So you could have not the right amount of motion blur, so it could be a little bit staccato. There are some plugins out there which will add a little bit of motion blur. That is the downside. What works best for slow motion? Well, things that are moving fast are always going to look good. When you're doing action sports, of course, that's going to look great for slow motion. But actually, people look great in slow motion. Faces look good in slow motion. You get these natural movements, you get the muscles, you get the smiles. That's actually my favorite thing to film. The things you don't always think about as being great for slow motion.
Now, as the ladder of life has been strung, you might think a sweep song the bottom is strong. Oh, I spent time in ashes and smoke. In this whole wide world, there's no happier bloke.
Okay, there's some 4K 60. I've changed the frequency to NTSC because I want to get some 60 frames out of the 4K. I just want those 10 extra frames, and I will conform it in post to my base time rate of 25p. But I am recording sound, I have a meter going, I have my VideoMic Pro on there just to get a little bit of Atmos. But I probably need to stop talking I want to get any decent sound. This camera doesn't shoot in 4K over 30 frames per second. So yeah, I could slow it down 25p and it would give me a tiniest amount. Wouldn't really register as slow motion. But it does do HD at 50 and 60, and it also does HD in 100 and 120. And it is cropped though, which isn't a bad thing sometimes, because I'm going to put on that same lens, a long lens 7200, and it's going to give me effectively a 140 to 400 mm focal length, which is going to be nice for getting those really long distance shots. The real downside to that is if you are shooting some 50 and 60p and you just want to get a little bit slower than that, suddenly you're much tighter and you'll have to go on a different lens. That's why I prefer my cameras to shoot slow motion without cropping. If it has an option of cropping as well, like some cameras do, then great. If you are just stuck with a crop, I tend to prefer ones which don't, so I don't have to change my lenses. And I think I'm actually going to mount it on the lens just to take a little bit of strain away from the lens mount. There we go. So this is in HD, and this is what it looks like when I conform it down to slow motion. I'm essentially playing it back at 50% speed. But I'm going to go to 100 frames now and look at the size of the frame change. It's a huge difference, much longer. It's great for picking off these shots. Not so great if you actually want to get wide shots. I'd have to go on a wider lens. But there's definitely an advantage at times to having a camera that can crop in slow motion. But yes, I would rather have a camera that can crop and not crop. Ah, the good old slow motion montage. These were shots taken during filming of The Wunderlist in different places around the world. If you watch the actual episodes, the amount of slow motion is not obviously continuous. It is mixed in with real time. But it is nice to edit them together, put it to some nice music, and just let it relax over you. One thing we're going to talk about later on and show you is the concept of speed ramping, where you actually record in slow motion, but you do speed ups and then go to slow motion and then go back to speed up again. This is a really nice way of using your slow motion shots. The higher the frame rate we go, it does of course mean we have to have shutter speed to compensate. The higher the shutter speed, the more light we need. Of course right now it's lovely, we have daylight, the sun's out, it's beautiful. I actually have ND on right now because I have too much light. But the darker it goes, the later it gets, we're going to have these issues of light and how much we have. In fact, I do actually have my first issue with interference because I'm focused right now down on the street and you can see in the distance that shop has a light on inside and it is flickering. This is my first issue. I'm only getting it though at 180 frames per second with my 360th per second shutter. When I drop down to 4K 50 and at 100th of a second I have no issues. So it's 50p, 50th of a second, double, it's nice and safe at 100th of a second. Just remember when you are shooting in slow motion, any camera moves you do are going to be a lot slower when you actually play it back, especially if you're shooting at that higher frame rate. So I did this rack focus from leaves onto this group of people sat down, and my move on the actual barrel was really fast. It's like a whip focus. If you do it at normal speed, you play it back, it will take like 20 seconds. Way too slow. Same when you're actually moving the camera. This is really the only time you're gonna whip pan the camera, unless you like that 80s MTV style. The only time. Just switch to a wider lens. So I want to do a little bit of movement, as in some whip pans I just talked about. So let's find something to whip with. It's gone a bit quiet. Okay. I'm waiting for somebody or something to move in front of my camera so I can do a nice whip with them, and it looks really nice on camera. This is a great example of interference. This shop is that 3 for 2 is flickering away at 180 degrees shutter speed, which is 360th of a second at 180p. So I'm going to switch to 4K and show you it disappearing. It'll still be slow motion, but only at 50p. And there you go, no flicker. Yay. Interference and flickering with your shutter speed is your #1 enemy when shooting high frame rates. I shot this in New York in January 2016 during Snowpocalypse. It all shot at 240 frames per second. So your shutter speed is at least 1/480th of a second, which is going to interfere with everything. And Times Square has screens galore, and the amount of flickering and interference I had was enormous. And the way that I got it to work was using a plugin called Flicker Free from Digital Anarchy. I'm never a fan of fixing it in post, but there is no other option for this sort of thing. There is no shutter speed, there is no way of shooting this without getting flicker. The downside to using this plugin, well, first off, it takes forever to render, and you have to experiment a lot with the settings until it looks good, because what it's doing is it's blending frames, and so it can create motion blur, which is not really what you want. But what else can you do? If you wanted to capture this in slow motion, there is no other option other than simply shooting at no higher than 60 frames per second. And that's not enough for me. I switched to this video camera here, and this has a number of options. When I'm using the record out, I am able to do continuous slow motion in 2K up to 200 frames per second when shooting in that 50i PAL mode. I'm going to show you how to use the buffered mode in a bit, but first off I'm going to film Julian and Sarah dancing randomly in this shopping area in Hereford Town Centre at 200 frames per second. As the bells strike for almost an end of a shooting day, I want to add a little bit more to this with some motion. This was really nice, but very static. There's a lot of motion going on in the screen, with this, I'm going to go in there and get some nice shots. I only have a buffer though when shooting in high frame rate of about 4 seconds, and I'm going to shoot at 250 frames a second. It does go up to 500 and 1000, but it's not great at that. This camera also does a buffer recording. I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that in a second, but first off, I think I'm going to get that shot over there, these guys.
Crossing at the state line, cruising down the freeway, sun in the high sky, trucks on the roadside, 2,400 miles of road, pulling out the drive-in Arizona heat wave.
4 seconds may not seem that much, but the shot I just did with Julian and Sarah dancing, when you play it, it's actually quite a lot. Now, when you do go into the edit, you don't really want to play that whole thing because it's too slow, too boring. Speed ramps should be used. So you record at your high frame rate and then bring it into edit. You speed up the shot and then you put a little slice through it and then have it back to its normal slow motion speed. And that way you get a really nice normal speed, and then when you get to the key moments, it just slows down. What I'm going to do right now is subject Julian to some cold water on his head. He's been complaining how hot he is all day, so this is his reward. Going to film him. I'm going to try and use the 4K 100 frames per second, which means I've only got 4 seconds to grab it in. I am going to use the end trigger mode. So basically I have to count the 4 seconds in my head. It's constantly buffering, constantly recording, and then when I hit record, it's going to save that last 4 seconds at 100 frames per second. It's going to take me, to get the timing right, maybe 5 or 6 attempts. Sorry, Julian.
No!
Okay, I am going to screw this up. And everybody ready? In 3, 2, 1, action.
I said not on my shorts.
I think we got it. Let's have a look. Thank you very much. That's my shirt. I had my little Sony RX100 Mark IV modified to shoot infrared, which is taking out the infrared blocker and then adding different filters on top. I have blog posts which go into it. I don't want to focus on that here. The special thing about this camera is it shoots at 250, 500, 1000 frames per second in HD. Although, to be honest with you, only the 250 is really usable, but it only does it in a 2-second buffer. So all I could do was record 2 seconds of real-time video, and then it would spend about 40 seconds writing it to the card. So it took me quite some time to accumulate enough shots for an edit, with just being able to get one shot every 42 seconds essentially, but it was worth it. continuous slow motion is nice. You hit record and it just keeps going and you capture the moment. Although you accumulate a lot of data. There's other ways of shooting slow motion, which is called buffered mode. How long the buffer depends on the camera. If you're shooting with really high frame rate cameras like Phantom Flexes, they all use that as well. And there is a real advantage to this because you don't accumulate all of that data. A really good example is I was filming in India on safari. We were trying to get some shots of tigers. We never found the tigers, but we did see some monkeys in the tree. And so I had my camera pointing at the monkeys, trying to capture the monkey jumping out of the tree in slow motion. And I hit record and I pointed and I waited. And the monkey was staring at me, didn't move. And I was watching the data being used up on my cards. 128 gigabyte card filled up. Onto the second one. I'm like, this is getting ridiculous. Half an hour later, the monkey still hadn't moved. Eventually, after 45 minutes, he jumped out. It's a terrible shot. Never used it in the edit anyway. Buffered mode would have been so much better, especially a mode called end trigger, which is what I'm going to show you in a second. This way, it continually records in its internal memory, a flash memory, for about, well, anything depending on the camera, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds. This camera does 8 seconds. And then when the thing you're waiting for happens, you hit record and it saves the previous 8 seconds. So what I could have done was point at the monkey, and as soon as he jumped out, hit record, and it would have saved just the 8 seconds, which is all I needed. For this next sequence, I'm going to be shooting with 2 cameras, a really fantastic video camera with very nice super slow motion features, and a small pocket camera, and I'm going to be filming Ella in the pool. Hello, Ella. And go. Yay. Let's see what that looks like. I'm gonna do one more and then we're finished. And I'm gonna do it on this camera here, the little one. Go! Yay! Brilliant! I think you can get out now. Unless you want to stay in. Get out. Stay in. You can stay in. Julian, should we get some more? She wants to stay in. Let's do some more. All night. And go! Thank you. Is it waterproof? I wonder if it's still in warranty. I'm going to use a camera which is designed to get wet. I'm going to use it underwater at 120 frames per second in HD. Are you ready? So what I want you to do, Ella, I'm going to move back and I want you to just here, I want you to splash as much as you can, just around here, okay? Yeah, underwater. Wait for it. Perfect. That was continuous rather than buffered, hence I can just leave it going. And I think that should be really nice. Let's have a look. And if you can't shoot slow motion, you don't have any cameras that shoot slow motion, just move really slowly and people might not be fooled. You may think 8 seconds isn't much. Well, it's not that much, but when you are recording in slow motion at 200 frames per second at a 25p base rate, that means it's 8 times more shots are accumulated. So when you're playing it back, that 8 seconds becomes 64 seconds. If you're shooting at 400 frames, it's twice that. And you shoot at 800 frames, well, you can work it out. In fact, when you look at these really high speed cameras like the Phantom Flexes, a lot of them actually only do maybe 2 seconds. In fact, the one that I shot, the shot which is at over 5,000 frames per second, the buffer was 1.2 seconds, which isn't much at all. That's why you need to get your timing right, and that's where N-Trigger really does help, because by the time you say action, you've almost lost your 1.2 seconds. This point and shoot only does 4 seconds. The previous generation only did 2 seconds, but you'd be amazed what you can get out of it if you get your timing right and make the right choice between start trigger and end trigger. Remember, end trigger is if you have no control of the situation, and start trigger is if you do and you can direct the motion and the shot. My favorite thing by far when shooting in the triggered mode is simply the fact you don't have all that data to go through. So at the end of the shoot day, you don't spend hours and hours offloading everything, which means I have more time to prepare for tomorrow, which is going to be a much more complex setup because we're going to be shooting indoors with fancy lights. This looks and sounds gross. And that's the point. This was shot using 2-second end trigger buffered mode in 250 and 500 frames per second. Sound is so important. You may have heard me say this in other episodes, but I can't stress it enough. All of these sounds are fake. All found online. None of them are actually sounds for what you are seeing. They're sounds which felt right for me or exaggerated what I was seeing on screen. I lit this incredibly strongly to get such a high shutter speed because, of course, when I'm shooting at 500 frames per second, I need enough light to have a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second, and that's a lot. This, though, was 1,000 frames per second, meaning a shutter speed of 2,000th of a second. And the way I got around this, because the quality is really quite poor, because there's no hard edges, you can totally get away with it. And the black background, there's no detail, because what happens in these high frame rate modes is they often degrade the image. You get patterns like moire, and you get nasty aliasing on edges. But if you can find natural things with nice curved edges and try and shoot in shallow depth of field, and to get rid of that noise, completely crush that background down. And in episode 8, where I talk about color grading in post, I show you just how much noise you can hide with some clever color grading. Without question, there is definitely a use for having an end trigger or start trigger at buffered mode, as well as a definite use for having continuous. Having both in a camera is ideal. And that end trigger mode is so important to get those moments which you have no control over, whether it's a lion yawning, or a hippo coming out of the water, or even just a seagull popping its head out from a dustbin. And speed ramping. Don't forget how important speed ramping is, otherwise the shots are just gonna go on forever.
Well, I own probably in the neighborhood of 25 guns, if I were just guessing. Some of them have belonged to my great-grandfather, and some of them have belonged to my father, my grandfather. And growing up with guns made me, you know, aware of the good and the bad that they can do.
3, 2, 1, action.
It's so nice and easy shooting high frame rate, slow motion outside because we have all that light. We need that to get our high shutter speed so we get the right amount of motion blur. In fact, the highest I've ever shot in high frame rate was just over 5,000 frames per second, which means I had to have a shutter speed equivalent to 1/10,000th of a second. And that means I need a lot of light. I actually had direct sunshine onto my subject to get my correct exposure. Indoors, like we are right now, to have that sort of light is going to be too much. So the frame rates I'm going to shoot at, highest will be about 250. Most of it will be 180 frames per second, as well as some 50 frames per second. The thing is though, slow motion is overused. And what I'm going to be seeing today, a lot of it is about speed. And I want to see that. So it's judging the right amount of stuff to be in normal speed and in high frame rate, making sure you get the right balance. Let the performance begin. So I'm shooting using anamorphic lenses, a 35, a 50, and a 70mm on a 2x crop sensor, micro four thirds. So if you think that field of view is going to be the widest I have is field of view equivalent on the full frame of 70mm. And anamorphics are really lovely. They're great for creating this beautiful, very cinemascope looking image. It's actually a 2x anamorphic. A lot of them are like 1.33, 1.66. So this is really super wide. One of the things we're not really going to see until we get up close is some of the classic lens flares that go with anamorphics. Because the anamorphics, what they do is they record the image so it looks stretched, and then you need to squeeze it down in post. My monitor right now is squeezing it for me so I can see what it's like, but this is what it looks like before we squeeze it. Anamorphics came about when the movie companies wanted to fight back against TV. They wanted to do something different. TV is very square, and so they wanted this nice, wide-looking image, but that could use up a lot of film. So what they did is they created a lens which uses up the same amount of film, but just stretches it. And what you need to do when you're projecting it back is squeeze it down. The way we're doing it in digital is we're simply squeezing it down in post. And this camera is great because it does have a proper anamorphic mode. A lot of video cameras will just put it onto the 16:9 sensor and just lose the left and right. This uses the whole sensor, so we're not losing any resolution. So this is really like a proper, true anamorphic setup. To maximize time, I'm going to go through all of the routines. As the wide, I will change lenses and do a little bit of close-ups from here, but not too close. Then we'll go up and repeat them all as a nice close-up on the stage and get some light flare and some more interesting looks. That looks terrific. Very nice. You do that last bit where you just sit down, just one twirl, and then crouch because it's such a lovely shot. Okay, in your own time. Okay, whenever you're ready, count to 5 and then start. I'll do that last bit one more time. I was a bit too high. That was really good though, like that. So that's great for the wide, it looks terrific. And I'm gonna get some real close-ups now. Switching between 4K, 50 frames a second, with sound, which we're recording, and the overcrank, 180 frames per second in HD. It's nice to get a bit of both. Obviously I'm losing resolution when I go to HD, but I'm getting all those extra frames. So that's kind of the sort of the toss-up, and obviously it'd be nice if I had a camera that would shoot 4K, 180 frames as well, but I don't. So I'm just mixing it up. I have to change my ISO for each one because of my shutter speed. Now you can shoot 100th of a second in 4K 50, but I need 360th of a second, and I'm shooting 180 frames per second. So I do need to push my ISO up by about a stop and a half to 2 stops. The house lights have been put on and I'm shooting in my 180 frames per second. This is the flicker that we don't want. But when we put on our proper lights, that goes. Domestics flicker, professional lights hopefully don't. So this is our last setup of the day. And it's gone really well. Despite the fact I don't have a wide lens on, I think I'm getting a nice variety. My wide being simply moving back into the theatre and looking back. And I think the contrast of the flat lighting front on and the beautiful backlight really does work together. Had no interference issues with any of the lights. So it's actually been a dream. Normally when you have these things, there's always something that gets annoying, irritates when it comes to flicker and high frame rate shooting. But here, it's gone very, very smoothly. Despite the fact I have lenses which aren't very fast on a camera that doesn't have great sensitivity. Because we do have this strong light, it's working really well. So, okay Ed, when you're ready, let's do the last setup. I really love this frame, this long frame. Talked about it in episode 1 about CinemaScope, and how Fritz Lang said that it's no good for normal filming, it's only good for filming snakes and funeral processions. I'm going to add to that. I think it's great for filming acrobats and jugglers in a theatre in slow motion. The anamorphics were really fun to use. Yes, the flares were a little bit J.J. Abrams over the top, but they gave those rear shots a really nice different look. One of the biggest gripes I have with many of the cameras that shoot this really lovely high frame rate is you do sacrifice image quality. It's a bit softer and it is noisier, and you're gonna have to deal with that in post, but you can fix so many of these things, and I've been dealing with these issues for quite some time. I will always take them over what I had to do before, which was always doing it in post. This was something I made for Sky News many years ago, and I really like what I got here. It was incredibly stylized and deliberate. Standard definition, mind you. That was done using the built-in slow motion tools within Avid. Whereas this stuff I shot in Switzerland for cliff diving, it was using Twixtor, which is a really good plugin, and if you do want to try it, there's some great tutorials out there which can guide you through it. We were really lucky with the lighting, not having any interference. Those stage lights were fantastic, but you can't always be guaranteed that, and you do need to test them, which is what we did. We tested them to see if there was going to be any flicker. If you're using those old bulbs with filaments rather than LEDs, you're going to need to make sure they have a really nice high wattage of, say, like 1K, and let them heat up. If you're using HMIs, make sure they have electronic ballast, not magnetic ones, because those will flicker. But if you're using modern LEDs, and especially battery operated LEDs, even at the lower output ones, you should not have any flicker issues. You just got to be careful if there's any practical light, anything that's seeping through that could be affecting the image. My favourite frame rate for shooting slow motion is actually 50p. I shoot 25p for most of my stuff because I am in a PAL country, and it's the perfect frame rate for speeding up to normal speed without being too much, and the slow motion is just that right amount. And using slow motion in moderation, it's the same for all of these things that we cover, whether it's sliders, jibs, slow motion, time-lapse, drones. It's about using them sparingly, otherwise it becomes a little bit boring. That being said, I'm now going to show you one of my favourite things that I shot in slow motion, and it's one single shot, all shot at 240 frames per second. I was going around London with my F55 mounted in the side of the car in the passenger seat, recording lots of people to get for a project. As I started to drive over one of my favourite spots in London for filming, which we will go back to in the next episode, I spotted a guy with what's clearly a camera wheelie bag and a tripod. It was one of me. It was a one-man band. And I matched my speed of the car. I didn't care what everybody else was doing behind me. They could beep away, and I tried to get him in perfect frame. And with Tony Anderson's music from Music Bed, it was the perfect marriage. One single shot, no ramps, no additional sound. This is what the actual shot looks like playing at real time. And talking of speeding things up, the next episode is all about the complete opposite of slow motion. It's time lapse.